Defence Dialogue, a podcast discussing contemporary challenges in the area of European security and defence. Brought to you by the Martens Centre with Niklas Nováky.
It's very good to be recording another podcast for the Defence Dialogue series, because it's been quite a while, like since the last episode, and a lot of things have happened, and there are many things that the EU is doing that I think are important to talk about, especially like this autumn, because the Conference on the Future of Europe is beginning. The EU is starting to prepare a new strategic compass for its foreign security and defence policy, and there's a lot to discuss. But I thought a good topic to kind of relaunch like this podcast series and to discuss about like is the issue of qualified majority voting in the EU foreign policy, which Commission President Ursula von der Leyen proposed in her recent State of the Union speech, and which was the proposal that gained the most applause from the assembled MEPs in the audience. And although it doesn't really, strictly speaking, relate to defense issues, because defense issues are something that the EU treaty only allows to be decided by unanimity, so all EU member states accepting. It still has to do with foreign policy and kind of making the EU a more effective and credible international actor. So that's why I thought this is an important topic. So I guess kind of important question, obviously, is like, what is qualified majority voting in foreign policy, and what was it exactly that like von der Leyen proposed in the State of the Union speech? Well, qualified majority voting is already the norm when it comes to decision making in the EU Council, which is the forum of EU ministers, like where they meet in various different configurations. So, for example, foreign ministers, employment ministers, agriculture ministers, and then take decisions on the relevant portfolios and issues that belong to their portfolios. And qualified majority voting, it's a kind of a voting method, like in the EU Council, in which a proposal is passed if it's supported by 55% of the EU countries and 65% of the EU's total population. So basically, if the supporting member states together have 65% of the EU's total population, I mean, then that helps pass the issue. And why this is such a big thing when we talk about foreign policy, the reason is that so far EU foreign policy has been decided mainly by unanimity, almost exclusively by unanimity. And what that means is that because like foreign policy historically, like ever since EU foreign policy making began to develop like in the late 60s, early 70s, like through mechanisms like the European political cooperation, now the common foreign and security policy, it's always been under unanimity. And unanimity means basically that every single member state, every single EU minister, like in the council, has to agree on a proposal before it's passed. And in other words, every single country, even the smallest country, can have a veto over EU foreign policy making. And the reason why everybody, well, not everybody, but a lot of people who follow these things in Brussels are talking about this issue again these days is that for several weeks we had this situation in which the EU couldn't sanction the Belarusian authorities over the country's kind of fraudulent presidential election in early August, because the country of Cyprus saw that at the same time when sanctioning Belarus, the EU should also simultaneously sanction Turkey over its energy exploration activities in Cyprus's exclusive economic zone. So the two issues were linked. And then because Cyprus saw that the two issues were linked, and because of various political reasons, the EU wasn't ready to move with the Turkey sanctions at the same time, nothing basically happened. And then for that reason, the EU's foreign policy chief, High Representative Josep Borrell, for example, mentioned that the EU's credibility is at stake in world affairs if it's cannot decide when things like the Belarus situation happens, or if there's something in the Eastern Mediterranean. Then the New York Times' chief diplomatic correspondent Stephen Erlanger also wrote that like the EU's kind of broader aspirations to be a credible international actor is at stake if it can't act when something happens on its borders. So for all of these reasons, the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, in her State of the Union speech, proposed that the Union should move into qualified majority voting, at least on human rights issues and sanctions. And it's important to remember that the Commission has also kind of made similar proposals like in the past. In 2018, I think, under the leadership of the previous Commission President, Jean-Claude Juncker, the Commission made a similar type of proposal in which QMV was suggested for sanctions, human rights issues, like von der Leyen did, but then also for the deployment and implementation of the EU's civilian crisis management operations. But now von der Leyen only suggested human rights issues and sanctions. But there's quite a lot of different kind of opinions in the Council over this. At the moment, the member states are rather like divided over QMV, and this is important because in the Treaty on the European Union says that QMV in EU foreign policy is possible, but it would require the unanimous agreement of the European Council for that to happen. So the European Council, the forum of EU heads of state and government, can decide that the EU Council can move to QMV on certain issues if every one of the leaders basically agrees to that. And at the moment, it doesn't seem possible, because although there are countries that openly support and champion qualified majority voting, like Germany and Finland, for example, the vast majority of them are either against it or quite ambiguous, so they don't have a very clear position yet. And so far, nothing has been able to, the EU hasn't been able to move forward to qualified majority voting. It seems unlikely at the moment that it would happen in the future. But I do personally think that there's no real alternative to a limited qualified majority voting in EU foreign policy for a couple of main reasons. Firstly, I personally worry quite a bit that if the EU isn't able to act and make decisions on foreign policy, especially when something happens on its own immediate doorstep, then over time, the responsibility for the common European decisions will move from the European Union to other non-European Union forums, like, for example, the E3 group, which includes France, Germany, and the UK, and which has been very active on the Iran nuclear issue, but which recently also held its first ever official meeting of defense ministers. And I think the E3 group is something which will become more and more important in foreign policy making, especially if the UK and the EU won't come to a common agreement over foreign policy cooperation after Brexit. So because the UK is an equal partner in the E3 with France and Germany, so it's a natural forum for it. But why I worry about the growing importance of groups like the E3 is that then foreign policy making responsibility will shift from the European Union into these groups. And then smaller countries who are not members of these forums will basically not have any say over the common decision making. And this, in my opinion, is a lot worse than any qualified majority voting or any risk that qualified majority voting might lead smaller countries decrease their influence over common EU policy making.
So what you're basically saying is that in order not to lose their veto capacity, some of the member states, the smaller member states, might find themselves even without a say. So for them, it's a dichotomy or a decision between having a say and an option to influence, but not to veto, or not having a say at all.
Exactly, because I mean, I think like that's the basic choice that like they're going to face. That I mean, if the option is that decisions are taken somewhere completely like different, like where they don't have a seat or where they don't have a voice, then QMV is the option that is the lesser of two evils for them, if you allow me to use that expression, and which still allows them to kind of protect and preserve like some of their like influence over the common decision making. And for that reason, I think they should ideally accept a limited move towards QMV. And there are kind of other reasons as well. Like I think kind of like if the EU can't act effectively when something happens on its own doorstep, then it raises kind of very legitimate questions about the union's kind of broader like strategic credibility as an international actor. I think it's very difficult for countries like Russia, China, the United States to take the union as a kind of a genuine peer actor on the world stage. I mean, if it can't even like if they have to wait for 2 weeks basically for it to come into an internal agreement, like what to do about Belarus and like what to do about the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean. But I mean, it's a tricky situation, and I kind of fully understand and agree. Understand, I mean, when smaller countries say that, oh, but this is kind of really bad for our national sovereignty. Like foreign policy is one of the last bastions of like what it means to be a state. And if we kind of lose that, I mean, then what are we? I mean, and these are kind of very important questions and topics to have. But I think politically as well, I mean, it's difficult probably for many national leaders to make the case at the national level that we support qualified majority voting and then potentially like be outvoted over an important issue by like some bigger countries. But I think personally, like this risk of smaller countries being dictated and outvoted is probably like a little bit overblown. Like why? Because I mean, the vast majority of decisions in the council, like they're taken by consensus, so they don't even get into a voting stage. So the decisions are usually agreed at the committee stage, and then when they go to the ministers, I mean, there's no formal vote because everybody already like agrees. And then there's a couple of stopgap measures in the Treaty on European Union as well, saying that if a member state objects a QMV vote for vital national reasons, I mean, then it can be delegated into the European Council to the leaders, where they again would decide by unanimity. So there are some kind of safety breaks as well. And basically, I mean, if the von der Leyen proposal that QMV would be used on sanctions and human rights issues is too much for some member states. I mean, I think it would be even okay if they would initially start just with human rights issues, simply to kind of test it out a little bit first, and to build trust and confidence among the member states and see like how it would go. And then if smaller countries especially could see that, I mean, they won't get outvoted, I mean, they won't get dictated to by the bigger ones, then perhaps there would eventually be room for then kind of increasing the use of QMV. And I don't know, I mean, do you think, I mean, this kind of, does this make sense to you, like at the moment, Álvaro? Do you kind of...
Yes, I guess this safety mechanism, as you mentioned, could be the deal breaker for some small member states that always raise the concern that even more now with the UK leaving the EU, a qualified majority will be very easy to achieve this 65% of the population at the moment from the moment when the big four countries align. If Spain, Italy, France and Germany agree on something, they would probably not need the support of many more member states. So if we go with this, first of all, let's say trial qualified majority mechanism in which we limit it to human resources, in which I think we all agree on, and then there's a few security resources in which, in case some national security or key importance issue on a member state level is at risk, you can go back to the council. I don't see how they can oppose. I don't think this is to threaten the national sovereignty. I don't think this is threatening their importance. As you mentioned and explained before, they might find themselves in a worse situation if these groups such as E3 start to take in the lead in this kind of decisions. So yeah, I think of course it's easy from me coming from a big country like Spain, but I think that people from Slovenia or Estonia can agree with us in these specific issues for now. And of course we can always do a trial, and if it doesn't work, figure out something else. So yeah, I think it's pretty clear.
Yeah, and I come from I guess, I mean, geographically a big country, but in terms of populations, it's a very small country, Finland, which has only about like 5 million people. But Finland is a bit of an anomaly in this discussion that, like, I think the government and then the president as well, like, they've been quite active and vocal about the need to kind of move towards QMV and the need to kind of increase the speed of EU decision making. And I think it's because, like, Finland understands that the EU's kind of effectiveness and credibility as an international actor, like, depends on its ability to kind of reach common decisions. And that's why the country, even though it's a small country and it recognizes that, I mean, if it would let go of the veto, I mean, then that would mean that, I mean, the decision-making culture would change. But then at least kind of the EU's speed and effectiveness would increase. But I think kind of this QMV discussion is part of a bigger kind of discussion about the future of EU foreign policy making that I think the member states need to eventually have, because, I mean, it might well be that, I mean, nothing changes at all. It might be that the member states, like, don't want to take any decisions to move to QMV, and the kind of current basic status quo, like, just continues. But then the question is, I mean, if not kind of more effective EU decision making, then what? Because even if they don't come to an agreement, I think then by default, I mean, we'll see kind of more forums like the E3 and a more kind of informal intergovernmental cooperation. So even a non-decision is a decision in a way, like, that has consequences, which needs to be recognized, that like, things won't stay the same because there is a need for Europe to act, regardless what the member states do. And yeah, I mean, this kind of, the problem of getting different countries and actors act in a coherent way is something that kind of has been a major problem, like, throughout centuries, like, throughout millennia, like, throughout history. And when I was kind of like, reading, like, different bits and pieces, like, before this podcast, I remembered a kind of quote from the history of the Peloponnesian Wars by Thucydides, which was written kind of about 2,500 years ago. And I printed the quote and just, like, wanted to read it here. It's something that the Greek leader Pericles, like, said at one point in the book. And the quote is, in a single battle, the Peloponnesians and their allies could stand up to all the rest of Hellas, but they cannot fight a war against a power unlike themselves, so long as they have no central deliberative authority to produce quick, decisive action when they all have equal votes, though they all come from different nationalities, and every one of these is mainly concerned with its own interest, the usual result of which is that nothing gets done at all, some being particularly anxious to avenge themselves on an enemy, and others no less anxious to avoid coming to any harm themselves. And I think kind of, like, when you read this and when you listen to it, I mean, it was written, like, over 2,500 years ago, but it kind of almost, like, describes exactly what the situation is, like, within the European Union at the moment. And I think kind of on this note, like, unless you, Álvaro, have any kind of further points or questions, I mean, we can kind of conclude this episode.
No, I think we came to a very interesting, simple conclusions, and well, with or without the qualified majority system, let's hope that the European Union finds itself coming quicker and more effectively to common responses. And maybe the Brexit will help in some of these matters, as the UK in the past opposed to some of the common alignments. So, well, let's hope for the best, and maybe in a few months we can celebrate already some qualified majority system for some of the foreign policy actions.
Or we wait for another 2,400 years and then read about similar type of problems also in the future after we've been cryogenically frozen. So let's see.
Well, thank you very much.
Cheers. Well, that's another episode done. Although like there was quite a long time difference like between like this and the last one I recorded. But I thought this was it was really good to have this discussion. I'm especially happy that my colleague Álvaro was here as well to like ask some pointed questions and prevented me from turning the episode into a pure kind of dull monologue to make it a little bit more interesting into all of you who very kindly, very graciously listened to it. And I hope we're going to be recording a new episode like sometime in the coming weeks already. I have a couple of ideas on my mind already. Strategic autonomy is an interesting topic that I could talk about. And then, like I mentioned in the podcast, the EU is in the process of preparing this new strategic compass, which might be an interesting, sexy topic to talk about as well. So until next time.
That was today's episode of Defence Dialogue. Subscribe to our podcasts for more.